Hey, welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. Just last week we had a new data pack come out, and this is Earth Scion. This is the third data pack of the Red Sand Cycle, so we're still here on Mars. Things are getting interesting. New miracles for a new world. This is what it looks like. If you're not familiar with the word Scion, Scion means a descendant of a notable family, so Mars, as in the Scion of Earth. It's in the title, really. Otherwise, I'm actually really excited to jump into this data pack. There's a lot of very interesting cards, a lot of effects that we haven't seen before, some wild stuff. So without further ado, let's jump in. I think we got 9 runner cards. We're going to start with those first. Again, there are always timestamps in the description below, so if you want to jump around, you don't want to listen to the whole thing, I take no offense to that. Curate your own experience, do as you will. And let's start here at the beginning. This is Beserker. Actually, sorry, every time I say without further ado, there's further ado. Netrunner DB doesn't have nice images of these cards just yet, so we're kind of working off of Card Game DB, which is an alternate website that you can go and talk about cards. I think this one's actually owned by Fantasy Flight Games, but the resolution of these cards is kind of lacking. So I'm going to do my best to read these out. I will be blocking the text behind my head. Nothing really we can do about that, but we'll still have the normal discussion that we normally do, so buckle up. Let's start here. This is an Anarch Fractor. For 4 credits and 1 MU, you get Beserker. Beserker says, it says a bit, I guess. So it's a 2 strength Fractor, and for 2 credits, you can break up to 2 barrier subroutines. Now, this is a fixed strength breaker, which is something we've seen in Anarch before. Almost all the core set Anarch breakers are like this. However, this one has a special clause on it. It says whenever you encounter a barrier, Beserker has +1 strength for each subroutine on that barrier. That will be for the remainder of the encounter, mind you, not for the rest of the run. So if you encounter a piece of ice that has 1 subroutine on it, your Beserker is now suddenly 3 strength. You can't increase it more than that, so hopefully that's good enough. Alright, so what can Beserker do? Beserker can break any any barrier that's less than 2 strength, and there's some of those. Those do see play, things like your ice walls and vanillas. But more importantly, Beserker starts to struggle to break things of higher strength. Yeah, it really does. So Beserker, if you hit something like, okay, I guess we'll pull things up here. If you want to hit something like a wall of static with Beserker, you can break it, because the idea is you hit a wall of static, it has 1 subroutine on it, so your Beserker is now 3 strength. You pay 2 credits to get through a wall of static. 2 credits for wall of static isn't bad. That's kind of the going rate for wall of static these days. Now, if you hit something that is 1 strength higher with a single subroutine, you actually can't get through it, and that's kind of an issue. This is Bastion. It's not a nice that sees that much play, but it's a 4 strength end the run, single end the run barrier. So if you hit this with your Beserker is now 3 strength, you can't boost any further, and you can't break your Bastion, which is kind of an issue. And there's a lot of cards like this. There's a lot of barriers that have single subroutines, things like Firewall perhaps. This actually does see a lot of play nowadays. Well, some play, I suppose. And then bigger things like this, like on the large side, you have things like Curtain Wall. And there's just a lot of barriers in the game that are high strength and don't have that many subroutines. Barriers generally don't have that many subroutines. So a lot of times I think the strongest or the biggest your Beserker will ever get, minus like ridiculous cards like Hive and there's a Jinteki card that has a bunch of subroutines on it. I can't remember the name of right now. But the idea is that your Beserker will generally be about 3 or 4 strength max. And that's kind of limiting to what you can do with this thing. So the thing that this is best at, the ice that this card is the best at breaking, is actually cards that are perfectly at 4 strength that have exactly 2 subroutines. Because it breaks that for 2 credits, which is pretty good. This is Eli 1.0, and Eli 1.0 is actually one of the most common barriers probably in the game now, just because it's only 1 influence. It used to be on the most wanted list. And Eli 1.0 is a taxing piece of ice. Breaking Eli 1.0 for 2 credits is actually, I believe, the cheapest you can break Eli 1.0 of any sort of conventional fractor in the game, and that's really good. Putting Berserk in your deck just to break Eli 1.0, I don't know if that's a reasonable thing to do, but if you're playing against a lot of Eli 1.0s, Berserker's looking kind of better. There are also other couple 4 strength 2 subroutine barriers, but this one's by far the most common. Now the problem with Berserker, and the problem about printing fractors in Anarch, is that there are better fractors in Anarch. If you're not familiar with the idea of the color pies, each of the runner factions, disregarding mini factions, are generally there's one subtype of ice that they're best at dealing with, and Anarchs are best at dealing with barriers. Now, the de facto best fractor, quote unquote, in the game right now is Paperclip. And you'll notice a lot of similarities between Paperclip and Beserker. Firstly, the install cost, the MU is the same. So you could play Paperclip for 4 credits and 1 MU. Actually, Paperclip is easier to install considering you don't have to spend a click doing it because you can install it from your heap, which is good. It also makes this card almost indestructible because if it's trashed, you can always just generally pull it back as long as it's not removed from the game, and Paperclip breaks almost every single piece of ice in the game cheaper than Beserker does. Yeah, it just does. The only exceptions are anything that's 4 strength with 2 subroutines, but everything else it ties or does it better than, like strictly better in a lot of cases, let alone there's a lot of ice that Paperclip can break that Beserker can't. Mind you, this is what Bastion looks like again. And that's kind of an issue here. Is that if you're going to print fractors in Anarch, they have to compete with the best fractors in Anarch because there's no reason not to play Paperclip. Also, if you want to splash a fractor, mind you, look at this, Beserker is 3 influence, so if you want to put Beserker in your criminal deck for some reason, you could also just put Paperclip in for 3 influence, and I don't see why you'd ever pick Beserker. Beserker is just inherently outclassed by the other options. Mind you, also Beserker and Paperclip are in the same 2-section block, or 2-cycle block, so they'll always be in rotation together, so I don't see why they would ever play Beserker. Now, if you do play Beserker, you're going to need support, right? Just because there's a lot of ice that you're going to hit that you're unable to break. So you either need support, ways to bring down the strength of ice, or ways to increase the strength of your breakers. So maybe you need to play things like Data Sucker, or maybe you want to play Null, one of the newer Anarchs. That being said, if you do want to play a fractor in this game that requires support to be able to deal with everything or deal with everything well, I think there's more compelling options. This is Morningstar, which is not going to be around for that much longer, but Morningstar, if you want to play something ridiculous that breaks things for super cheap but requires support, I think I'd rather play Morningstar over Beserker. Yeah, there's a lot of limitations, but this breaks just about any ice for 1 credit, which is pretty good. On the other side, you have Nifr, or Nifr, I think is maybe how you say it, and Nifr requires support with Data Sucker, but actually in the late game will prove to be a better fractor than our friend here, Paperclip. It is, in theory, like risky because if it's trashed, all your work is undone, but the idea is if you want to live the dream of I need support to get a good fractor in the late game, I'd rather play Nifr and not Beserker. I don't think Beserker is ever going to see much play, and I don't see a way in which this card will see play, besides if suddenly there's only in the meta 4 strength 2 subroutine barriers, which is unlikely, or 4, I guess, what's the other option? You have 6 strength 4 subroutine barriers, which I don't think there's any in the game. So that's kind of rough. I do want to do a shout out though, like this ability of increasing the strength of the breaker based off how many subroutines is a very cool thing in this game, and I'm glad that they're exploring different design spaces. I think this card would actually see play if it had a thing attached to it where if it actually could boost strength. Like if this had 1 credit for 1 strength or 2 credits for 2 strength attached to it, and maybe I think you would actually have to decrease the install cost of this breaker. This breaker would be super cool, and it would be comparable to Paperclip in a lot of ways. It'd be like, oh, this is a decent breaker that's actually good against like certain ice, and it's an interesting meta choice. But the way it's currently printed, I don't think this will see much play, which is unfortunate because it's a cool design. It's definitely a cool design. Let's jump on to the second Anarch card, and this is Persephone, or Persephone, I guess if you insist. We are going to jump between Netrunner DB and Card Game DB just because we have the nicer art here, and I like this website a lot. So this is Persephone. It's another icebreaker in Anarch. This is 5 to install and takes up 2 MU, which is insane. It's a killer, so it breaks sentry subroutines, and it starts as 1 measly strength. You can pay 1 credit to boost the strength by 1, which is not bad at all, but you pay 2 credits to break a sentry subroutine, which is largely rubbish. However, this card has some like really wacky text on it. Whenever you pass a sentry, you may trash the top card of the stack to trash 1 card from the top of R&D for each subroutine on that sentry that resolved. And this is a very nuanced ability, and we'll get to it in a second. Firstly, I just want to talk a bit about the flavor. There's been a lot of references in these cards in this whole Red Sand cycle to Greek mythology and Greek lore. Persephone, also known as Cora, I suppose. She was the daughter of Zeus, and she's the harvest, and the harvest goddess Demeter. She's the queen of the underworld. There's this story that, sorry, I should show you what she looks like. That's her. So Hades is the god of the underworld, and he kind of fell for beautiful Persephone, and he wanted to marry her, just be with her. I'm not actually sure, and he they were not okay with this. Zeus wasn't okay, or Demeter wasn't okay with this. So Hades kind of ripped up through the ground, made a tear in the ground, and she fell through and she went to hell. This is actually one of the origin stories of why we have winter or seasons. The idea is they've came to an agreement where now for 1/3 of the year, Persephone is going to be down in hell with Hades, and that's when all the harvest and everything dies, and this kind of represents the cycles of winter and summer and spring and all that. So that's cool, and you kind of see that in the art here. You see Persephone falling into what maybe is hell, or just some sort of hellish red place. So that's cool, and actually that's sort of thematic on how this works. Like, you have to pass through something terrible, and then out of it there's a bit of destruction, but then sort of growth, maybe you could argue that. I'm not entirely sure. Art's cool. Art's good, and this is actually on a playmat if you are lucky enough to win the 1-of playmat for, I think it's cash refresh tournaments, which are super exciting. So, as a Sentry Breaker, how good is it? It's really bad. It's just not good. And I think that's fine because of the condition attached to it, but this is not something you want to rely on in Sentries. So firstly, it's incredibly expensive, it takes up half of your MU, and its numbers are not good. Firstly, 1 strength isn't great. You have to boost 1 credit for 1 strength, which is not terrible. Generally, sentries are lower strength, but 2 credits for sentry subroutine, or 2 credits for any subroutine in this game, is generally never proven to be a sustainable way to deal with ice. Specifically, sentries is kind of the worst case because sentries generally have a lot of subroutines. They're generally low strength, lots of subs. So this card is brutal. If you want to break an Ichi 1.0 with it, which is generally our common, oh no, let's just do Architect for today. If you want to break an Architect, which is a very common HB sentry, which you generally have to respect, it's going to cost you 6 credits, which is really rough. That's really rough, and you're not going to do that. So on its own, it's just not good as a Sentry Breaker. If you want to look at other Sentry Breakers, you got Mimic and Faction, and this is a good Sentry Breaker. If you want to look at a bad Sentry Breaker that this is comparable to, it's Sunya. Sunya is kind of similar to Ennefer, but it has 2 credits per break Sentry subroutine, and that alone is just not good enough in this game, considering you can just play Mimic and then play something like Data Sucker. I pulled up a list of the barriers, mind you, and this mostly shows all the barriers that, what's it called? I prepared these before and then I forget what I do. But these are basically, if you see these, all the barriers that, what's it called, can't deal with. Ashikaru is the one, we couldn't think of the name. But this is the ones that Beserker can't deal with, and they're a bunch of barriers. Or not can't deal with, but struggle to deal with if can't. Alright. So yeah, I hope we can agree that Persephone as a Sentry Breaker isn't very good. But the ability on Persephone is definitely interesting. I'm not sure how great it is, but it's definitely interesting. And it's not worded very clearly, and it needs some sort of a clarification. Luckily, we do have the UFAC, but this is how it goes. You have to pass a sentry. That means that the sentry has to not end the run, and you have to get through it. So you have to pass a sentry. And once you pass the sentry, you may trash the top card of your stack to trash 1 card from the top of R&D for each subroutine on the sentry that resolved. Now this is not clear, and I didn't understand how this works, but if you pass a sentry that had 5 subroutines on it that all resolved, you don't have to trash 5 cards from the top of your stack, you have to trash 1 card from the top of your stack. So go through a Komainu that has 5 subroutines, let them all fire, trash 1 card from the top of the stack, and then the corp trashes 5 cards from the top of theirs. It's not 5 to 5, it's 1 to 5. Doesn't matter how many subroutines, just trash 1, and that makes this card a lot better. So let's talk about the conditions. You have to pass the sentry. This only fires based on the amount of sentries subroutines that resolved. So this is obviously very good at getting through sentries that have lots of subroutines. A lot of subroutines. And let's just look at the sentries. So these are all the sentries. Sorry, I'm at the bottom. But you'll notice there's like basically 3 kinds of sentry subroutines. And most of them don't work very well with your Persephone. Firstly, you have trash program subroutines, and these are very common in a lot of sentries. A lot of sentries will trash things. Archer, like most of these sentries, well, not all of them, but a lot of these sentries will trash programs. And you have to let these sentry subroutines resolve. And letting a trash program sentry subroutine resolve is actually it's gonna ruin your day with Persephone, because the corp can just trash your Persephone and then this won't fire, because this only fires when you pass, and it's an active ability. So if they trash Persephone, you can't choose to use a Persephone ability, so that's not good. You can't let trash sentry subroutines fire. You could, in theory, play something a bit clumsy and play things like Sacrificial Construct and then prevent your things from being trashed, but this seems like pretty convoluted, and I don't think is a very good way to do this. But you could, in theory. Now, the other kind of popular sentry subroutine are subroutines that do damage. Net damage, generally, sometimes meat damage, brain damage. And these sentry subroutines are a lot easier to light fire. The idea is if you hit... Well, let's just pull up Komainu, because Komainu is one of the best examples. If you hit a Komainu and you have 5 cards in your hand, this gains 5 subroutines, and you can basically let them all fire. You will lose all your hand, but the corpse just lost 5 cards from the top of their deck, which is massive. Milling 5 cards at the top of the corpse deck is huge. They go into archives, you can run and then access them. Admittedly, you have no cards in hand at this point, so accessing shocks and traps and stuff like that can be lethal, and that's a problem. But that's honestly not too bad. There's also some interesting cheese here, where if you expect or know where Komainu is, you can just draw up to like maximum hand size or above that, I mean. So you can draw up to like 8 cards. You can draw up, maybe you have a huge hand, maybe you have 15 cards in hand. Run through your Komainu, you throw out your entire hand, and now the corp trashes most of their deck, a large portion of their deck, and that actually might be a winning strategy with this Persephone card. Seems kind of hard and only works if the runner or the corp is running 2 or one of the 2 sentries that scale with hand size, which is Komainu and the other is Brainstorm. So that's not really a strategy you can count on because that won't work most of the time, but that's interesting at least. Yeah, also for what it's worth, I've had worse in factions, so sometimes hitting net damage or meat damage subroutines, there's not a lot of meat damage subroutines, is maybe not that bad for you in Anarch. Now, the last kind of sentry subroutines are the sentry subroutines that you can actually let fire. These are things that generally do traces. Sometimes you can either beat the trace, that counts, because you let it resolve, or you can just let the trace fire, and you actually get fires from Persephone. You can, in theory, run through Architect and mill the top 2 cards of their deck, which honestly, like, that's kind of counterintuitive, because Architect brings a card back, so it's, like, not great, and also they can now, like, take the top card off of their R&D. This actually sounds pretty bad. But the idea is like you could run through a Veritas, for example, and just let everything fire. You can run through a Thoth, let everything fire, perhaps. Veritas is a good example. And then just mill 3 cards at the top of the deck. Now the question is whether there's enough sentries in play that are basically you can ignore and are annoying if you ignore, but you can let them ignore, and I don't think that's the case. A lot of the sentries are in the decks or are in people's decks because they matter and they're generally punishing or face checks or something like really rough. So I'm not sure you can actually put down Persephone and just kind of run through things. It's interesting, and I think this card requires probably a bit more support, but on its own, there's a lot of matchups where this card isn't fantastic. Against HB, not a lot of the sentries you can let fire. And against Jinteki, I think maybe he's your best bet, and that's kind of all you have. Yeah, that's all you have. Now, another card that scales with like subroutines, I just want to talk about this specifically because I think a lot of people will come up with this idea, is the tour guide. And that's another kind of point with this card exactly. It's not trash cards at the top of the deck for each sentry subroutine that resolve. It's only after you've passed the ice. So say you're running against a tour guide that has 14 end the run subroutines. You actually have to pass tour guide. You have to pass them, and the subroutines have to resolve, which means if you like bypass this with Inside Job, the subroutines didn't resolve. If you bypass this with Fem, the subroutines didn't resolve. And if you let the end runs fire, you didn't pass the ice, but the subroutines did resolve. So it's actually very difficult for all the conditions on this card to fire. And this card has a bunch of conditions. You have to pass the sentries, they all have to fire, and that's kind of difficult. It's a very expensive card, and it's very hard to put into your deck, and your deck has to kind of be built around this. I don't think this is like a card you can put in your deck and just hope it works. So interesting deck building might be coming out, but I don't entirely see how you can build a winning strat out of this, unless there's like very specific sentries in the game that you think you can kind of benefit off of, and even then this is a lot of MU, so you have to build around that. Definitely an interesting card though, very interesting card. Alright, we're hitting the criminal cards. Oh yeah, shit, we don't have art for this, so we're going to switch over here. This is Rubicon Switch. It's a unique piece of hardware. Just to talk about the theme a bit, Rubicon. The Rubicon's a river in Italy. It's famous because it is a river that Julius Caesar crossed in 49 BC. Crossing the Rubicon is generally a term that, well, it says here, right? History. Crossing the Rubicon... Oh man, we found it. Oh, we had it before. This is a river. But the idea is that there's expression about crossing the Rubicon as being like launching on an expedition or a group going on some sort of large change that they can't go back from. This is also like the crossing in which the Julius Caesarian phrase, the the die is cast. Oh man, let me search this. I'm butchering this. The die has been cast, has been attributed to crossing the Rubicon, and crossing the Rubicon is referred to any individual or group committing itself irrevocably to risky or revolutionary course of action. Interesting enough, also the word Rubicon comes from the Latin word rubico, which comes from the adjective rubius, which means red. Which is interesting because this Rubicon switch is the little red switch there on the right. And it's very thematic when you understand what this card does. For 3 credits, you get this piece of hardware. It's unique, so there's only one Rubicon switch. And it says X credits and a click. D-res a piece of ice, res this turn. X is a printed res cost and uses ability only once per turn. This is a card that de-reses ice on command with very little interaction with the corp, which is something we haven't seen before. We haven't seen that before. Every other de-res card, oh, that's actually not true. We just recently saw one, but most other de-res cards in the game require interaction, and this one doesn't. The idea is that you run, the corp reses 4 credits for an ice. You either break it or you don't, and then you just spend a click and 4 credits and you de-res the corpse piece of ice. So you've just traded 4 credits for the corpse 4 credits. Admittedly, you might have traded a bit more if you've broken the ice, but otherwise you're basically trading at par with the corp. And we've seen that before in a card, a very, 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 very strong card, and that is Vamp. The idea with Vamp is you can trade credits for the corpse credits. And a lot of times if you have more credits than the corp, you win, because now you have money the corp doesn't. They can't res ice, they can't defend anything, and for the next couple turns they'll probably be clicking for credits, which is one of the worst things you can be doing, because you have no choices of what you can do anymore. And this card seems really scary. It really, really is scary, and while it is a bit pricey, I don't think it has to be that pricey. This is Los. Los is a criminal who came out of the red sand cycles, and Los gives 2 credits the first time the corp reses a piece of ice. So this changes the math pretty heavily. If I run, the corp spends 4 credits resing piece of ice, I gain 2 credits, and now I can de-res that piece of ice for 4 credits, which means I spent 2 credits to deny the corp 4. I did spend a click on that. But that's the idea, is that you can make this math very unfavorable. You want to stack this with compromised employee. Now if I have, best case scenario, 3 compromised employees, you can res a piece of ice. Say you res your 4 credit ice, I'll gain 5, and then I can de-res it for 4. So I've actually gained a profit while you just lost 4 credits. That is a bit of the best case scenario when you have all 3 of these down, but you can tutor for them if you want to, with things like hostage, if you really need to get these down. But that seems really very, very good. Just look at, because I have these up, just look at the other de-res effects in the game and how much harder they were to fire. Emergency Shutdown immediately is free, but you had to run HQ, which can be difficult. This card we recently just came out, and this actually confuses me that this card came out while we have Rubicon Switch. This is Brute Force Hack, which basically says the text on Rubicon. It says de-res a piece of ice that has a res cost X. This is a double, so basically the extra click is like installing the Rubicon, but it's 3 cheaper. However, you can use this card whenever, while Rubicon you can only use once a turn, and only if the ice was res this turn. So it is technically a bit more flexible, but I think Brute Force Hack won't see that much play if Rubicon exists. Rubicon seems brutal. It's very hard to gauge the quality of this card, largely because the meta, at least the competitive meta right now, has moved largely away from ice. We're playing a lot of cards, or a lot of decks that are relying more on upgrades and relying more on just going very, very horizontal. And I don't entirely blame Corpse. The idea is that there's so many cards being printed, and there's like 4 or 5 cards in this pack that are printed that attack ice in a very rude and meaningful way, that it's one of the biggest defenses just not relying on ice. Because I could see a deck that exists where you just constantly de-res the corpse ice as long as you have enough money, and the corp will bleed themselves dry just trying to res that single piece of ice on R&D. Admittedly, that deck might be slow, and it can only do this once per turn, which really does balance this card out, but I think it's still kind of brutal. It still seems very, very good. Yeah, I'm kind of worried about this. One of the ideas that works really well with this card is Leela. I think Leela works really well with this card because you want ice to be de-res with Leela, so you can actually run HQ. They res the piece of ice, you get your count safe and off, and now you can de-res that ice on HQ with Rubicon. And the idea with Leela is when the corp steals or scores an agenda, you can bounce a de-res piece of ice. So you can now, or unres piece of ice. So now you can de-res a piece of ice on HQ, and now maybe run the remote, or now if the corp scores next turn, you get to bounce the HQ ice, and you can actually kind of run and be aggressive with Leela without letting the corp permanently basically res ice, which is kind of one of the best things you can do against Leela because that spells safety. Also, if Rubicon picks off, you can start playing some weird stuff. Like you can start playing Blackguard, where you can expose a piece of ice, force the corpse to res it, and now you can de-res it with Rubicon, which can be pretty gross. We also have Forged Activation Orders, which works really well with Rubicon. The idea is that you run HQ, they res a piece of ice. You can even do this turn one, like sure gamble, play Rubicon, run HQ. Oh wait, maybe that's few clicks. But the idea is that you can like run HQ, de-res a piece of ice and forge it in the same turn, knowing what it is, so that trashes the piece of ice, and that can be pretty strong. You can also forge a piece of ice and then immediately Rubicon it and then run HQ, so you have information of what you're running into. I don't know why I keep saying HQ, but this card is just... it's good. I think it's really strong and it's kind of scary. I could see a very control. You need a lot of money to res this or to fire this. I think playing Los makes it very easy. I think playing Los a compromise employee makes it very easy. But I'm actually pretty scared of this card. It becomes more of a liability to run bigger ice, and it encourages you to run cheaper ice. Like Rubicon doesn't matter if all your ice is like vanilla strength, and that's it. I'd be excited to see more ice that has an ability that fires when you res it. Something that says when you res this piece of ice, like gain 2 credits, and it's a kind of crappy piece of ice. Something like that I think is interesting. We haven't seen that so much. Ice that have like interesting effects, and I think that would kind of go a bit for kind of fight this. I don't know how good this is going to be, just because again in the competitive meta a lot of decks are horizontal, but this seems very, very, very good, and you can play a very strong control criminal if you do please, and I think it might be all right. No, that doesn't do anything. Let's move on. This is Aeneas. It's Aeneas. I looked this up. Aeneas Informant is another criminal card. It's a research connection. 0 to install. And it's very simple text. It says, when you access a card with a trash cost, not in archives, and don't trash it, you may reveal it and gain 1 credit. It's also 1 influence, mind you. Oh, we didn't talk about the influence on all these other cards. No, it's not very easy to splash any of these. Aeneas Informant is 1 influence, so you can splash this wherever you want. So what does this do? Whenever you access a card and you don't trash it, and it is trashable, so that can be assets, it can be operations, now it can be upgrades, sometimes it can be ice, you can just gain a credit and not deal with it. This does say you have to reveal it, and that's so if you're running R&D and you like hit a trashable, you can't just say, hey Corp, trust me. You have to reveal the card and be like, okay, look, you have a pad campaign coming up. In one way, that's actually really not good to be doing, because now the Corp understands what they're going to draw, what they're going to top deck, so they can understand how to play around it, whether they want to like res certain ice later in the turn, whether they want to res their pad campaigns, whether they want to immediately shuffle with Jackson Howard. Like revealing information to the Corp that they don't know, that's only on R&D largely, is not the best thing to do. This card also stacks, which is interesting. So if you have 3 of them up, you can access a card that has a trash cost and not trash and gain 3 credits. But well, yeah, the most important thing to say before is if the card is rezzed, you don't have to reveal it, you'll still gain your money. The reveal clause is only if the card is basically in R&D, because that matters, but in all other servers, the Corp will know what you're accessing, so the reveal clause doesn't matter. If the card is rezzed, this still works. Okay. So what's the dream? The dream is to have 3 of these up, because they're not unique connections, and then run like naked remotes that have trashable assets in them, and then just gain 3 credits, which makes this thing comparable to not comparable, but better than our friend Magnum Opus. The idea is that you can run, spend a click, gain 3, instead of Magnum Opus gain 2. It is a bunch more parts to pull together in theory, so it's a bit slower, but it's also cheaper to install. These are 0 credits a pop, right? Which is not too bad at all. This also combos with Desperado. Some Desperado now makes it click for 4. You do have to access the card, mind you. This is Desperado. This is a horrible spelling, Desperado. You do have to access the card, mind you, so it doesn't work with things like security testing or bank job. So those don't combo together. But still with Desperado, and like even Desperado in a single Aeneas Informant, you can run a remote and basically click for 2, which is pretty good. Also, like, you don't spend any tempo putting this down. It's 0. You can also gain tempo from putting this down. This is off-campus apartment. It's a bit risky. It's easy to splash, but it's a bit risky because you're putting all your metaphorical eggs in one less metaphorical basket, I suppose. But the idea is that you can play your Aeneas Informant on this thing on your off-campus apartment, draw a card, and you're good. Play Desperado, and now you can check remotes, and if you don't want to trash them, gain 2 credits, and if you have 2 of these, even more, and even more the later the game goes. Now the question is, you're not trashing stuff, so what are you doing? And that's where this card actually gets pretty interesting, because I think a lot of times cards in this game you want to trash. Generally, if an asset or an upgrade or something that's trashable that's in a corpse deck is in their deck, at least at the competitive tables, it's because it's good. And it's because it advances their game plan in some sort of meaningful way. So there's not a lot of assets in a lot of like HB asset spam decks that you can actually leave on the table. Admittedly, this just makes the click nice where you can run and check something, and if you don't want to trash it, you'll maybe gain 1 or 2 credits. That's kind of cute. And sometimes also this involves a turn where you're just going to run, and then on your 4th click, run and trash it, and you've probably gained money as much as you didn't do much else that turn. That's very interesting. Also, this does combo well with Temujin Contract for sure. We've seen this sort of economy before in decks, in like very passive decks, with this card called Au Revoir. Au Revoir says you gain your credit when you jack out. It's also non-unique, so you can have 3 of them. And then people are playing jack out decks by playing things like Snitch, or just running empty uniced remotes, and then you can jack out before you access. And then having this economy where you click for 3 credits, basically. And apparently it's been good enough to see successful play at top tables. And this is very similar. However, more decks run ice than more decks run unprotected assets. So it might, in some ways, be more reliable to set up this, and of course, admittedly, multi-combo deck combo, multi-card combo. But if the corp is running naked remotes, you actually can get a lot of value from this. That being said, I don't know if you run Centrals, how many times you're going to access something and not trash it. Just because trashing things when you access Centrals is generally good, because now you can run again and see a new card. So I don't know, but this card is definitely very interesting, and for 0 credits, you can put this in an off-campus apartment, get some card draws from it, just cycle through your deck, and that seems pretty solid. It's yet to be seen whether 3 of these on the table is going to be a busted engine, but it's definitely in the right direction of we need cards that aren't orange that can help you deal with wide corps. Admittedly, this might not be the best answer considering if you're not trashing things, you're not fighting the wide corp, but at least it's something. Interesting card, definitely interesting card. Let's move on. This is Rosetta 2.0, and this card I like way more than I thought I would. I really like this card. It is a virtual resource. It is 4 influence, mind you. So as much as it's virtual, you might have a hard time putting that in Apex because it is virtual. It's 3 credits to install Rosetta 2.0. Mind you, we don't have Rosetta 1.0, so I'm not sure if that name... Oh, maybe Rosetta 1.0 is the Rosetta Stone. Just to give you an idea, it's named after and has the likeness and the image of the Rosetta Stone, which is this giant rock, largely. It has 3 versions of the decree written in, I think it's Egyptian, Greek, and something else. Shit. Demotic script. Don't know what that is. But it's this big old rock, and this rock was actually really key when it comes to translations or learning ancient languages, because it has the same text in 3 languages, so if you understand one, you've just learned 2 other languages, or at least learned how to read them. It's a big deal. It's a very... Oh, shit, that's what it looks like. It was a very, very, very meaningful artifact that's been found and fought over for years. So this is Rosetta 2.0. You spend a click. Remove an installed program from the game. That's part of the cost. And now search your stack for a non-virus program, shuffle your stack, then install the program, lowering the install cost by the cost of the program removed from the game. This is a program tutor in Criminal, which is wild. We've seen program tutors in Criminal, but not specifically. We've seen tutors in Criminal. Oh, shit, I forgot to mention this. Aeneas Informant works really well with Maw, because you don't trash in the Maw fires. That's very worth saying. I got all these tabs open. I don't remember what I'm trying to say anymore. This is Special Order. Special Order's in the core set. It's a 3 of in a lot of Criminal decks because you can pay 1 credit and find an Icebreaker and add it to your grip. And finding Icebreakers is generally good because that's how you get through Ice. And then the corp can't score in the early game. You can land those early account siphons. Now, a lot of people might look at Rosetta 2.0 and say, like, I have Special Order. Why the heck would I need this? It's 3 credits to install. I have to remove a program from the game. That's super slow and clumsy. And I'd argue it's actually really good. And the reason why, it says program. Admittedly, it says non-virus program, which I think is very intelligent design, because if it didn't say that, this thing would be just busted. You'd put one of these down with noise, and then every turn you just trash to install a new virus, and it'd be 4 mils a turn for free, largely. And that would suck. But this only gets you icebreakers, and I think a lot of the best cards in Criminal are actually not the icebreakers. A lot of times they're the programs. They're either utility programs or pressure programs, and now you can go find them. So what's the cost of playing Special Order? You pay 1 credit and an extra click. Rosetta 2.0, you pay 3 credits, which is a bunch more. Admittedly, it is a resource, so you can cheat it out a bit with Career Fair, and you can cheat it out a bit with Supplier, perhaps. But the idea is that you have this down on the table, and now you spend a click, and not only do you find the program from your deck and install it, which is something Special Order doesn't do, but you also install it at a cheaper rate. So some difference between the 1 credit you pay for the Special Order and the 3 credits you pay from your Rosetta 2.0 you might make back. And it might actually be beneficial to do this. It might be cheaper in the long run. You can also use it as many times as you want. Admittedly, you have to trash a program, but I can argue that's probably not that big of a deal. Removing a program from the game also is not a big deal in Criminal, because a lot of times you don't have any recursion outside of Steve Cambridge. So if you're removing a program or trashing a program, it's generally gone anyways. And I'm also glad that card said it. Otherwise, this thing would be absolutely busted with cards that can come back from the heap, like Paperclip. So how do you use this card? That's Paperclip. How do you use this card? I think you have to intelligently, I think this card changes deck building, and that's why it excites me so much, is that the decks that I think can accelerate Rosetta 2.0 aren't the standard decks you might have been seeing. And there's a bunch of ways to deal with it, and we're going to go through all the cards I think work well with this, because I think this card's actually really exciting. It's a tutor for a program. That's a big deal. Okay, check this out. This is Cache. Install Cache. When you install Cache, you just gain 2 credits. That's not fantastic, I guess, if you're playing Con. This is self-modifying code, mind you, and just compare self-modifying code with Rosetta. This costs 2, this costs 3, you can use it as many times as you want. You do have to trash a program, but the program comes in cheaper. That's honestly not that bad. It's not that bad. If you want to play Cache, you can play with Con installed for free, so you gain 3 credits, and now you can Rosetta away your Cache and find a program from your deck, reducing the install cost by 1. Not a big saving, but it's not bad. So you played something that was tempo positive, admittedly not the most exciting card in your deck unless you can capitalize off of this with other cards, things like Technical Writer. But the idea is you gained 2 credits and now you installed something at cheaper. Not fantastic, but it's definitely good. Other cards that are good with this are cards that are good in the early game and not so much great later. Oh man, not so much great later on. So cards like Tracker might be good in the early game, and then you can Rosetta it away. Admittedly, you'll save nothing, but it's still fine. I think cards like this are very interesting, cards which have a lifespan. So you can play your Cerberus Rex H2, you play 3 for it, you use all your tokens off of it, and now you Rosetta it away and you pull your next Rex for free or another card for a significant cheap value. Admittedly, this is an icebreaker, so you can always get it with your what's it called, your Special Order. Mind you, you can also play Special Order with same old thing. So, but Overmind I think is the beginning of where this starts to look really, really good. You play your Overmind, it gets, 3 counters on it, maybe more if you build your deck around it. Once it's done, you can use your Rosetta 2.0 to trash your Overmind, to install a new Overmind for free. And you can cycle through all your Overminds. You don't have to draw them, you install them for free. That's a lot of value if you're building a deck that's Overmind based. Other cards that are really cool are cards that are conditional of when they have value. So early game or even mid game, you can play a Sneak Door Beta. And once the ice on Archives gets bigger than the ice on HQ or just not profitable, you can now Rosetta your Sneak Door away and install basically anything from your deck for likely free. On the opposite, you can also trash one of your programs to install a Sneak Door out of nowhere. And that's insane because you can't tutor Sneak Door Beta in Criminal. This also changes deck building, where if you used to have 2 Sneak Door Betas in your deck, you might now have gained a slot. Admittedly, you might be using those slots on Rosetta 2.0s, but you now have a card that lets you tutor this card that is largely untutorable. On top of that, you have other like pressure cards. You can now instantly swap your Keyhole for a Sneak Door Beta or other way around. That's fantastic. A lot of Criminal cards will play, or a lot of Criminal decks will splash a single copy of a pressure card, generally things like Keyhole. Admittedly, you can't use Rosetta with Medium because it's a virus, but you'll play things like Keyhole, Sneak Door Beta. Another really good one is Equivocation, which I've been struggling with decks where if you don't draw your Equivocation early enough, you kind of fall apart. And now you have a card that lets you tutor these one-ofs that you can splash in your deck and play a bit more like a Shaper, which is really exciting. The idea that, oh wait, I think the best play right now is trash my, who cares, trash my second copy of my decoder, and now I have a Keyhole and I can win. That's really good. Same with Equivocation, same idea. Magnum Opus might actually be a really, really big deal. Earlier in this, we talked about Rubicon Switch and playing a more control, money-happy Criminal. And the idea that you can tutor for a Magnum Opus on, in theory, maybe turn 1 or turn 2 is insane. And you can play 1 Magnum Opus in your Criminal deck and think, I am going to draw this for sure by maybe turn 3 or turn 4. If you play 2 Rosettas, maybe 3 Rosettas. And that's nuts because this opens the design space of Criminals where you can now play one-of cards that define your deck. And that's very exciting in this game. Collective Consciousness is another cool example of a card that maybe has a value written on it, where it has a lifespan. So it's good in the early game, and then once you don't have MU for this or enough Ice's res because you've been face checking like mad, you can get rid of this. That's cool. You can also play one of this and tutor it. That's cool. Snitch. Also very good. Card you play in the early game. Once you don't need it anymore, get rid of it. Install something that's 3 credits for free. That's cool. That's really cool. Again, Net Shield. Man, like we've got a whole list of reasons why this card's cool. You can pull now a card like this, which now makes your matchup against net damage things really good. And all you have to do is sacrifice one shitty program. And again, this play up multiples of programs. I think a good way to play this is playing like a bunch of mammons. Play cards that, it's just not a plural. Play a bunch of cards that are just good universally. And if you just forfeit this, it doesn't matter. Like the idea that you paid 3 credits for your mammon and you don't plan to use it is fine when you're going to forfeit this to install your keyhole. So like the cost of the mammon, you basically paid for the keyhole. It's only good admittedly if you need your keyhole right away or if you're going to use your Rosetta more than once, but it's good. It's definitely good. And it blows open design space. You can start playing weird niche cards like Schedule Analyzer. You can use it, you can find it when you need it, and you can Rosetta it away after. Because you're not going to recur this card. Hemorrhage, same idea. Pressure card, one of in the deck if you want it. Play some weird Ken Hemorrhage. Have fun. Paintbrush, have fun with stealth. Make this easy to find with stealth. This is so cool. And Au revoir combo is also a thing you could do. You can also splash Trope as a singleton. I need recursion. Let's get this back. You can splash Reaver. Play this in Geist. Admittedly, now you can play one of these and actually you will find it. You'll just find it. That's really good. I am very excited about this card. It'll change deck building. It's not that inefficient compared to Special Order if you build your deck around it, and allows you now to play like this interesting control criminal where you can play one of very like pressury cards. You can find your pressure when you need it. You're going to play a bit more aggressive where you can be like, okay, I'm going to trash this program because I don't need it now. You can play multiples of some programs. This card is dope. I'm a big fan. These are the kind of cards that open the design space and allow new cards and new decks to flourish. And I'm really excited when we see cards like this. I think this thing's way better than it looks. This is a cool card. Let's hit the Shaper stuff. We have Adjusted Matrix. This is a mod. It's hardware. It's 5 to install, which is a lot. And it says install Adjusted Matrix on an Icebreaker. Host Icebreaker gains AI. So it's an AI now. And you may spend a click. Sorry, I said that wrong. It also gains like the paidability clause. You may spend a click to break subroutines during encounters with pieces of ice. It's 2 MU, so you could splash this. It has a quote from Guru, who we've seen since the core set, who said you can't teach an old breaker new tricks. That's on point, Guru. This card actually has a pretty interesting history because it was spoiled in one of these official Fantasy Flight Games kind of spoilers, like check out what's in Earth Scion, and it had different text on it than this. It had some very confusing text where it wasn't clear how many clicks you spent for breaking how many subroutines. Like it wasn't sure if it was like a linear relation or if it was 1 for 5 or whatever. So they actually reworded the card and printed it like this. Which is interesting that they heard like feedback when they revealed the card and people said, yo, this is kind of not good writing, and then they fixed it. However, they fixed it not good. There's 2 very important things to learn about this card. Firstly, it does nothing. This card is absolutely useless. It honestly does nothing but adds AI to your programs. And that's because you cannot spend clicks during a run. The game Netrunner does not allow you to spend clicks during a run. It's just not a thing you can do. You can't spend clicks during a run. You've probably seen something like that when you see Biroids, things like Eli 1.0, that say the runner may spend clicks to break any subroutine in Eli 1.0. You may spend clicks to break subroutine, but you can't like use paid abilities on ice. On programs that cost a click. And if that was the case, like you could magnum opus while you're running, right? Because this says spend a click gain 2, but you can't do that. You have to actually spend a click when you can spend a click. There's certain windows for that. Biroids are different. This card can't be used. It honestly does nothing, and they've addressed this. They've addressed this in the UFAQ. When can the runner use the ability gained by Adjusted Matrix? And it says the runner can use this ability if the host Icebreaker meets the strength. We have to talk about that. And you may spend treat the card as if it said host Icebreaker gains AI, and you may spend click to break any subroutines on ice currently being encountered. Right? Oh, that's the difference between AI, right? Oh man, I'm prepared with this, huh? Yeah. Yeah, it has to say currently being encountered. I think that's the big clause here. The point being is that this card does nothing, and the only way that you actually can make it work is by honoring the UFAQ. Now, Michael Boggs here says the errata for this card will be issued in the next FAQ, and he's been very good with this. The FAQ did recently come out, and everything he said would be fixed was fixed, and fixed well. Now the question is, how soon does the FAQ come out? Because this card in a tournament setting, say you have a tournament on Saturday you want to go to, it's the European Nationals is on the Saturday. If you play this card, you can call a judge over it, and I don't think the judge is allowed to follow the UFAC. So technically this card's dead, and it will be dead until a new FAQ comes out, and I hope it comes out fast. Yeah, this card just doesn't do anything. It's also really expensive for doing nothing. So that's a bummer. But let's talk about how it is going to be ruled to work when the FAQ comes out, where you can now trade clicks to break subroutines. Firstly, as we mentioned in the FAQ, this does not break clicks inconsiderate of strength. So Eli 1.0 is a bad example. So let's just pull Curtain Wall. Curtain Wall is strength 6 or strength 10, and if you put this thing, you have to attach your adjusted matrix on something. So say you attached your adjusted matrix to a Gordian Blade. Gordian Blade is strength 2, and for an icebreaker to be able to interact with a piece of ice, you have to match the strength. So to be able to use your adjusted matrix to spend a click to break through a curtain wall that's 10 strength, say, mind you, you have to spend 8 credits and then clicks. Which is wild. I think a lot of people will forget about that and just think, oh, I'm going to Biroidize anything. But that's not how it works. You actually have to boost the strength, which makes this card a lot worse. And makes it so you only want to strap it onto things that have high strength or are cheap at boosting strength. Which doesn't sound fantastic. There is one breaker in the game that's like a really big deal and you want to do that. And that is Endless Hunger. Endless Hunger is the strongest strength breaker in the game. It's 11 strength. It can break every single piece of ice in the game, besides ice that's advanced out of the strength, and it's actually a very interesting combination. You play Endless Hunger for 0, it takes up all your MU, and then you strap this down with adjusted matrix, and now you can get through every piece of ice in the game. You have to spend clicks. Oh, not every piece of ice in the game, because you actually can't break things that say you can't be broken by AI, so you can't get through Turing, but you can click through that anyways. That's interesting. It's definitely interesting, and a large reason why that's interesting is Apex actually struggles with a lot of ice. If you read Endless Hunger, it says you can only break an end the run subroutine, and there's a lot of subroutines in this game that aren't end the run subroutines, and you have no way really to interact with them in Apex unless you splash to other breakers. And now with the addition of Adjusted Matrix to your Endless Hunger, you can now actually break just about everything. On one hand, that's really cool because you can break just about anything. But on the other hand, it's actually kind of super anti-synergistic. When you're playing Apex, a lot of times you want Apocalypse. And Apocalypse means that you need to run all 3 central servers and then have a click left over. And if you're going to spend a click to break ice subroutines because you can't break with them, you're never going to be able to land your Apocalypse. Admittedly, also, Apocalypse is kind of bad once you spend 5 credits to set up a multi-card breaker. So I'm not sure if you just play Endless Hunger and don't play Apocalypse. But technically, this is a big deal for Apex because it lets Apex deal, admittedly kind of clumsily, but it lets Apex deal with a lot more ice than it used to be able to. Also, this card does combo well with E3 feedback implants. This card won't be along for too much longer, which also E3 already kind of worked really well with Apex. But the idea is you can spend 1 click to break a subroutine, and then you can start paying credits to break the other subroutines. So if you want to get through a 3 subroutine ice, you don't have to spend your entire turn. You can spend 1 click and 2 credits, which honestly isn't too bad. But again, you need a lot of cards to set this up, and you also have to match strength. This card's interesting. Mind you, it does make your Icebreaker AI, so do be careful of cards like Swordsman or cards that hate on AI, because now you've just kind of made your breaker liability, and that's kind of rough. I don't know how much AI hate is coming around these days on competitive tables or casual tables. I play Hortum, and Hortum is kind of pretty happy when you have AIs on the table. I like this ice a lot. That's Adjusted Matrix. Technically does nothing. Eventually it will do something. How good is it? I don't know. It's very expensive. It's also a really cool card. It's 2 influence, so you can splash it. So in theory, I imagine you could put this on a breaker that is like easy to pump to high strength. This is super convoluted, admittedly, because you can just break with this easily. But the idea is, this is a bad example. But the idea is that you can strap this onto something that has high strength. Knight? No, this is a bad idea too. But the idea is that like you can play something with Adjusted Matrix and then Siphon turn 2 or get some really early aggression, because with an Adjusted Matrix on any sort of breaker, especially a breaker that's high strength, you are now able to get through just about anything. Actually, maybe you want to do something like Sharpshooter. Maybe that's good. But yeah, the idea is that you can now put on pressure because you can contest any remote. Admittedly, it'll be most of your turn, but putting that on a card that boosts 1 for 2 strength, starts at 3, that's pretty good. That might actually be a reasonable breaker. Maybe it is. Talk about reasonable breakers. This is the second Shaper card. It's dedicated processor. It's 2 credits. It's also a hardware mod. And it says install dedicated processor on a non-AI icebreaker. So you can't put it on the card that you've already hit up with your adjusted matrix. And hosted icebreaker gains 2 credits plus 4 strength. Better, faster, stronger. Which isn't that the stronger together? Let alone like just Daft Punk. Isn't that the stronger together motto? I'm not sure. But the idea is that you strap this onto something for 2 credits, and you get 2 credits plus 4 strength as a paid ability. It's 3 influence, so it's sort of splashable. This must say something like that. Oh no, totally different. Anyways, this makes breakers good. This card might be an issue. This is kind of like a Rubicon type of card where I'm really worried because it seems abstractly really powerful. I think Dedicated Processor has a bit more of a chance of warping the meta in some sort of negative way. And that's largely because it takes some of the breakers in the game that have been generally the most troublesome and removes just about all limitations from them. 2 credits for plus 4 strength is really good. Like, even if you strap this to any breaker, that's a really good value. So you can strap this to any breaker that doesn't have good boosting numbers, and now it's, like, pretty efficient. It's reasonably efficient, but it gets absurd when you strap it to things like this. This is Yogg. I think Yogg is the biggest contender of making this card a problem, but Yogg 0.0 is, it's on the most wanted list because this card is absurd and has been warping the meta since it's come out. It has a really strong impact on what code gates are being played. You pay 5 credits for Yogg, takes up 1 MU, and now you can break any code gate subroutine for free. It's also 3 strength. And that's it, you can't boost it. So the idea with Yogg is Yogg kind of, if you're playing Yogg, all code gates that are 3 strength or lower are just not worth rezzing. They just don't make them good. And when Yogg is in vogue and people are playing Yogg, a lot of times people won't play code gates that are less than 3 strength. They'll just give up on them. So the option was just play high strength code gates and then just play barriers and sentries and all that. You could boost the strength of Yogg by playing things like Data Sucker and getting that up, but I don't think you need to do that anymore. If you have your Yogg, which is admittedly a bit expensive, you attach your dedicated processor on it, which is not that expensive, you have a 3 strength code gate that you can break any code gate that is, you have a 3 strength decoder that can break any code gate of 7 strength or less for 2 credits. Any code gate in the game, I don't know if there's any 8 strength code gates. I don't think there are. Any code gate in the game, you can break for 2 credits. That seems like an issue. That honestly seems like an issue. Because if this becomes popular, I don't think people will run code gates anymore. Admittedly, it's kind of hard to find all these pieces together, but like it really invalidates a large portion of the ice. And this is the same kind of issue that we've seen with cards like Cipher, where it just takes like large portions of the design space and says like, oh, they're really not worth playing. Because if you're going to spend like 7 credits on a beefy, like you can spend 6 credits on a Fairchild 3.0, and then this gets broken for 2 credits, it doesn't look good, it doesn't feel good, and a lot of people just don't do it anymore. They just don't run these cards. And that's kind of an issue. Like, this is a Fairchild 3.0, really taxing piece of ice. Generally, a lot of times, like the Gordian Blade test, breaks this for 6. You want to play DNA Tracker? Gordian Blade breaks that for, what, 7? Yogg with this thing breaks it for, 2. Whoa. And that's kind of nuts. That's kind of nuts. And it's not only Yogg, right? Like, you can play this on other fixed strength breakers. You can play this on Mimic, and now you have probably the best sentry breaker in the game. You can break any, like, play 2 with now a 7 strength sentry, and then you break 1 per subroutine. 1 influence, mind you. And if you want to go, like, hog wild, you can also maybe consider playing Morningstar. Morningstar is a cool card that I wish saw more play. But the idea with Morningstar, you pay 8 for this, and now you can break 9 strength, or even higher. Like, you can double boost with this thing. Like, I'm saying 7, but you can go higher. But this, you can break any, basically, barrier in the game for about 3 credits. Actually, no, Curtain Wall is 5 credits, but that's really good. Admittedly, this is 4 influence. A lot of these cards affect all these cards are Anarch, but I don't think the best thing you could do is actually, like, splash these in Anarch, because they're hard to find. Like, you can't tutor for this card, and it's a lot of influence. I think you're much better off playing these in Shaper, and then playing one of your Yogg and one of your Mimic, and then finding them with your tutor cards, things like self-modifying code, and then playing three your dedicated processors and having an absurdly good rig. This is another thing that I brought up before with Rubicon Switch, is that they're printing way more cards that punish ice in Netrunner than they are that punishing like horizontal strategies. So that's kind of why they're flourishing at a lot of competitive events. And that's, I think, an issue so far with the design space. Like, I just wish there were more cards that were as powerful as, like, Yogg with a dedicated processor, or as Rubicon, or stuff like that. The same way against horizontal strategies. And we haven't seen that so far in the game. The best thing we have is a wizard. Yeah. This could be an issue. This is also just like a fine card. It takes the kind of slot that we had before on things like Net Ready Eyes. And Net Ready Eyes is cool, but this gives you +1 strength. And 2 for 4 is like pretty comparable anyways. Like, I don't know if you play Net Ready Eyes anymore. It is a bit less influence if you're splashing it. Sorry, wow. I just started raining really hard. Hopefully the audio is fine. But this might be an issue. This honestly might be an issue. I don't know. It combos really well with System Seizure, because now if you're breaking through multiple code gates, multiple sentries, you can boost once in a row, and now you save some money. I think that's pretty sweet. How do you fight this? I think trashing programs, it gets really good. If you can Hunter Seeker and now trash this card that they've, like, this breaker they've installed multiple cards on is kind of expensive, that's good. Admittedly, if you're playing Shaper, you have ways around that. You can play Film Critic, you can play Sacrificial Construct, and you can get around Ice Destruction. On top of that, Egret now actually gets really cool. I think Egret gets very interesting, because now if you're playing your, like, giant mammoth Yogg thing, you can take any sort of ice. Like, you can find a 7 strength Sentry, and you can now break it for 2 credits. Yogg is also just a good breaker, mind you, so, like, it's not bad to play that anyways. But if you can just take all the code gates in a corpse deck and say I'm going to break them for, like, 2 credits a piece, that might be an issue. So I don't know. Ice isn't looking so good no more. This card's really, really good. Shit, that doesn't work. This is the last Shaper card we have. It's Inversificator. It is a decoder. It's an icebreaker. It's also a code gate breaker. That's a decoder, right. It's 6 to install, 1 MU. And it says the first time you pass a piece of ice each turn in which you use Inversificator to break all subroutines, you may swap that ice with another piece of ice. And sorry, we should probably talk about the numbers on this first. It's 2 strength, 1 for 1 strength, 1 for a code gate subroutine, 3 influence. Alright, on its own, 2 strength, 1 for 1, 1 for 1 is the same numbers we see on Gordian Blade, and that's generally been our de facto standard let's compare numbers for code gates. And that's not too bad. Admittedly, Gordian Blade keeps the strength for the remainder of the run. This one doesn't. Also, this one's 2 credits more to install, which is pretty sizable, especially early game. Like, that's an expensive breaker. But this card comes with a very, very, very interesting ability. And it says the first time you pass a piece of ice each turn in which you use this thing to break all the subroutines, you can swap it. And you can swap it with any other piece of ice. It doesn't have to be a rezzed ice. It can be unrezzed. It just has to be an installed piece of ice. So you can't use this on an ice in archives, or an HQ or an R&D. But it just basically, you can move the board around. And that's a really big deal for a bunch of reasons. First reason is you're playing Shaper. Generally, and Shaper has a lot of these effects, cards like Gordian Blade that retain their strength for the remainder of the run. So it's in your best interest to put all the code gates on one server. Ideally, probably R&D. And if you can do that, you can now run through R&D probably relatively cheaply, and that's generally a win condition for Shaper. Make a lot of runs on R&D. Another option you have is Cyber Cipher. Cyber Cipher is really good. You get all the code gates on one server, you can kind of chew through them with Cyber Cipher. I think one of the most compelling reasons to run Inversificator is Kit Peddler. Kit is an identity from Creation and Control that she's so interesting, but I never saw her succeed at top tables that easily. And it's the first time you encounter the first piece of ice you encounter each turn gains code gate until the end of the run. So the idea is that you want to make sure the code gates are not on the outside of servers, because that kind of ruins your ability. It uses up your ability for no reason. So you can run a piece of ice. It'll be a decoder, it'll be a code gate, and you can break it with Inversificator, and now you can move it regardless what it is, and you can now start to construct servers. And you generally want a server that has like a code gate in the back, and in the front is a sentry, which you can break for free or very cheaply, and you can actually build some really, really, really interesting servers. I think that's very exciting. One thing also worth noting, it says the first time you pass a piece of ice in which you used Inversificator, which if you want to do interesting things with Inversificator, you do want to run more than one decoder. Not only is this expensive to get at early game, but the idea is that if you want to I want to break through a code gate and then move or Inversificate the second code gate on that server, you have to use your primary code gate breaker to break through the first one and the Inversificator on the second one. So it probably does make a lot of sense to run things like Gordian Blade. Or if you're playing Kit specifically, I would recommend you running Yogg and maybe that dedicated processor thing. Because the idea is that you can now put 3 strength sentries or 3 strength barriers or less on the outermost piece of ice on the servers, and now you can break them for free with Yogg at least once per turn. Inversificator also like just kind of laughs on something that hasn't been that good that far, and that's positional ice. The idea is that you have positional ice where I need my chum in front of something else. You can now move the chum behind the ice that is protecting, and you kind of nullify positional ice. Positional ice doesn't see that much play, but it actually might in the near future with things like Ag Infusion, or however you pronounce that card. So this is definitely interesting. This is a very cool card. It's like a mini Escher. Escher is a very strong card. Being able to put ice on different servers, being able to put the strongest ice on archives if they do ice up archives is a pretty big deal because you're not going to run that very often, and just repositioning things to make your ice servers easier to get through is huge. This card is expensive to install, but on its own, it's not a bad breaker, and I think that's generally what we've seen with the design space. If they're going to put really interesting effects, like things like Persephone, for instance, they're going to put on a breaker that just kind of sucks. And this one doesn't. Like, 6 is a lot, but on its own, this is not a bad code gate breaker. It really isn't that terrible, and I could see some decks maybe putting this as their primary code gate breaker. Honestly, even if they're not playing kit. Just be like, I'll pay 6 for this, and then we'll do weird stuff. We'll do really, really interesting stuff. Definitely cool. You also do get some value with this with Egret, but I'm not sure intelligently what you can do with it. But it's definitely a very interesting card. And I think you'll see a lot of kit playing this. Oh yeah, really important thing though, if you are playing kit, or you do play someone that gets Inversificator, don't ice servers that you don't think the runner's going to run. And I think we mentioned that before. Like, the idea is if you ice archives now, they can now take their best ice, your best ice, and break it with Inversificator. Hopefully it's a code gate, or hopefully they egret it or something, and now they can put that on archives, and now you've wasted a really good piece of ice. So just be careful. You have to play around this card, which is pretty cool. Last card, Dadiana Chacon. She is a connection. I believe Dadiana is technically a female name, classically. There's one Dadiana. It's unique. 0 credits to install. It's really cheap. It's a resource connection, so put on the off-campus apartment with all your Aeneas Informants. And it says when your turn begins, gain a credit if you have fewer than 6 credits. And it says when you have 0 credits, trash Dadiana Chacon, and if that's not bad enough, take 3 meat damage. Alright, definitely a very flavorful card, but I'm not convinced it's that fantastic. When your turn begins, gain 1 credit if you have fewer than 6, so 5 or less, is a pretty big deal. Gaining credits at the beginning of your turn is huge. The cheapest way that you have to do that to set it up is Underworld Contacts, which requires 2 link, which can be a setup, but that's 2 credits for that ability. This is 0 credits. This card will pay off the turn after it's installed, which is pretty good because you don't lose any tempo on it. However, it does nothing. It doesn't trash itself when you have over 6, but it does nothing when you have above 6. Above 6 and above. So it's kind of useless. It is kind of useless. How much of the game do you spend at 5 or less credits? Hopefully it's not a lot of the game. I actually can't think of many decks that like reliably spend or stay on low credits. Not only there is a possibility that you can build a deck that does that, but the bigger problem is that that deck probably won't be that good. There's just a lot of cards in Netrunner that punish the runner for not having a lot of credits. Very easy is that you have Brian Stinson. Brian Stinson says you have less than 5 credits, the corp makes infinity money, and that's an issue because your 1 credit turn is not worth Brian. There's also just like hard-hitting news is an issue. You can't really run because as soon as you run, you'll get hard-hitting news because you don't have a lot of money, and that's also an issue. Just breaking ice can be an issue if you're spending credits to break ice, because if you have less than 5 credits, there's not a lot of servers you can contest unless you're running something that doesn't require credits, things like perhaps Fwast. So I'm not sure how good that is. There are ways to like offshore your money. Like you could play algo trading, so you can put your credits in a different place so that you technically don't have a big credit pool, and then when you want to go, you can trash this and go, which isn't terrible if you want to like juggle how much money you have just to gain the 1 credit per turn, which doesn't seem fantastic. Again, this like technically seems sort of okay if you're playing Nasir Medan, but Nasir actually has huge problems whenever you have 0 credits clause, because you have 0 credits a lot with Nasir, in fact more than any runner in the game. And actually that's a very important thing to understand. Whenever you have 0 credits, that's not only when the core plays closed accounts or like you just don't have any money, but that's also when you play events sometimes. I think the only one that comes up a lot is Sure Gamble. Not a lot of people notice this, but if you have 5 credits and you play Sure Gamble, you for a second, you go down to 0 credits. Like you play 5, you pay the 5, you now have 0. Now the event fires, you gain 9. So if you play Sure Gamble with 5 credits while you have a Dadiana Chacon, you trash her and take 3 meat damage. So you can't do it. Let alone, I don't know if you would play like Sure Gamble in a deck that runs Dadiana, just because it makes it so hard for Dadiana to fire. But technically, be careful of that. Also, like, it doesn't work with Order of Sol. You can't use Order of Sol to always dodge being in 0 credits if you think this would be a cool combo, which in theory it would be. But it just doesn't work like that. They've clarified that in the UFAC, because technically you have 0 credits and then you gain 1 credit. So, not fantastic. I don't see what you can do with this one. The liability of taking 3 meat damage, I don't know how often that's going to fire. Like, if you don't go down to 0 credits, it's kind of your choice. But if you don't have less than 5 credits, why are you playing this card? Eventually, if an archetype exists that wants to be on low credits for some reason, we've seen a bunch of these archetypes arise that kind of, you're like hurting yourself to get some sort of value. Things like what's it called? Oh man, the one where if you run with no cards in your hand, you get an extra click. I can't find it now. It's a card. There's an Anarch card. There's this whole Anarch like idea that if you have no cards in your grip, things are good for you. And even that hasn't worked. And that seems easier to work than having no money, because generally you need money to interact with the corp and also to like just ensure safety so you don't die to traces and stuff like that. Yeah, not fantastic. A very flavorful card though, and I'm glad that exists. I just can't think of a way to make this good yet. If you have any idea, let me know. And that's all the runner cards we have. A lot of really interesting stuff in this pack. A lot of really strong stuff. I think Persephone is very interesting. It might not be fantastic, but I think Rubicon's cool. Aeneas is definitely worth looking into. I think Rosetta 2.0 is way better than it looks. Dedicated Processor is probably very, very good. Inversificator is good. And, I don't like saying cards are good or bad, but at least I like the design, and I think you can do interesting things with them, which is kind of mostly of what I enjoy about Netrunner, is doing weird, interesting things. Yeah. Anyways, that's all. Let me know what you think about these cards. If you have any cool deck ideas, let me know about those too. I'm going to be hitting the online streets and building some decks with these cards. That's always really exciting. Otherwise, stay tuned. In the next couple days, we'll have the corpse side of this data pack coming right up. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned. Ciao.